My name is Tom Compass. I'm the director of the Crawford School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Let me take a moment first to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, the first Australians, and pay respects to their elders past and present. Crawford School is ANU's public policy school. Along with high-quality postgraduate teaching and world-class research, we care about public policy engagement. And this takes many forms. The sort of policy impact we look at takes the form of direct collaboration between individual academics here at Crawford and throughout the ANU with the public service, the public sector generally speaking, and a host of events, orations, workshops, secretaries' roundtables, dialogues, and special events like today's event with the Minister. Minister, thank you again for coming. Thank you for coming back to the Crawford School. You're always welcome here, and very happy to have you here today. The order of the proceedings is pretty simple. The Minister will talk for 30 or so minutes and can take longer if he likes, no problem. He'll be introduced with my great pleasure by the Deputy Vice Chancellor here at ANU, Lawrence Cram, who I'll call up here in a second. After the Minister's remarks, he's kindly offered to do a Q&A session, which I'll help manage. And then he has to go, I think, quite promptly at 12:25, 12:30, 12:25. Okay, I was trying to get a few more minutes, but 12:25. So I'll watch the clock for you and make sure you're on your way. Good stuff. Thanks again for coming. Welcome to Crawford. My great pleasure to call to the microphone our own Deputy Vice Chancellor. Please welcome Professor Lawrence Cram.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks very much, Minister. Your Excellencies, colleagues, friends of the ANU, ladies and gentlemen. On the 8th of November this year, after 20 years of debate, the Federal Parliament passed historic legislation to tackle climate change and to move Australia towards a clean energy economy. I'm delighted to welcome to the Crawford School and to the ANU campus the Minister whose portfolio is charged with leading the implementation of this legislation, the Honourable Greg Combet, Minister for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. The Minister is going to speak today about the topic Carbon Markets and International Linkage, Australia and the UN Climate Change Conference, Durban 2011. And as Tom mentioned, he's kindly agreed to open the lecture up to questions afterwards. Greg Combet AM MP was first elected to Parliament for the New South Wales seat of Charlton in 2007. After the 2007 election, he was appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Defence Procurement in the Rudd Labor government, and in February 2009 he was appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Climate Change. During 2009 and 2010, Mr Combet served as Minister for Defence Personnel, Materiel and Science, and as the Minister assisting the Minister for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. In this later capacity, he was responsible for winding down the insulation program and implementing the new Renewable Energy Bonus program. Following the 2010 election, he entered Cabinet as Minister for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, and he's overseen the development of the Gillard government's plan for a clean energy future, including the carbon price. Before entering Parliament, Mr Combet was Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions. Mr Combet has degrees in engineering and economics and graduate qualifications in labour relations law, a really important part of his qualifications for a venue such as this. Please join me in welcoming to the lectern the Honourable Greg Combet.
Thank you very much, Professor Cram, for the introduction, and thank you also to Professor Tom Compass and the Crawford School for giving me another opportunity to speak to you today. It's a repeat performance from last year with a few different things to report. Welcome to members of the Diplomatic Corps who may be here, other distinguished guests, students, staff and friends of the ANU, and I see a few members of the Department of Climate Change scattered through the audience too, so welcome to all of you. A year ago, when I spoke here, we stood at the threshold of what Australia's Climate Commission has called the critical decade. And the critical decade is a window of just 10 years in which the world still has an opportunity to act decisively on climate change at reasonable cost, to address the 3 centuries-old trend of emitting ever more carbon into our atmosphere, and to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. On the last occasion I was here, I spoke of the national interests that should drive Australia's approach. And these included, firstly, a strong economy, an economy in which prosperity can be decoupled from pollution, where we make the fundamental reforms we need to grow in a new era, as other countries around us will do. The second thing I mentioned on the last occasion was the importance of intergenerational equity, because we have a responsibility to make the right decisions and right investments now so that we do not leave a world of disadvantage to future generations. Thirdly, I indicated the importance, of course, of maintaining a habitable Australian continent, because the cost of the world not acting on climate change is too great for our country and too great for many others. And now that the government has legislated its clean energy package, I'll add a fourth important national interest criteria, and that is the development of strong international carbon trading markets. 1 year into this critical decade, I want to point to the progress we're making here in Australia and the progress being made globally. And I want to outline the approach that Australia will take to next week's United Nations climate change negotiations in Durban, and to our international climate change engagement more generally. So firstly, in relation to what's occurred over the last 12 months within Australia, because we've made real progress in tackling climate change and meeting our responsibilities in the international community. Because 2 weeks ago, as you would be aware, the Australian Parliament passed the government's clean energy legislation. This follows 37 parliamentary committee inquiries, 25 years of scientific warnings, and legislation that has been presented 4 times to the Parliament. Finally, as the Prime Minister said, carbon pricing is the law of our land. The Clean Energy Act will rank with one of the biggest, or with all of the biggest, structural reforms of our economy, along with important measures that I will recall during my working life: the floating of the dollar, cutting tariffs, and introducing sophisticated industry policy in the 1980s and 1990s. Things like the introduction of compulsory superannuation contributions that have provided a huge boost in national savings and overcoming inequality in wealth. All of these important reforms of the last 30 years, I think we can say that introducing carbon pricing into our economy, along with the other measures in the clean energy legislation, are very important reforms. Pricing carbon, in fact, is the economic reform of the 21st century that will decouple Australia's prosperity from growth in its pollution. It is, in fact, in the government's judgment, the foundation of our future prosperity. It's an economic reform that is essential to maintaining the international competitiveness of the economy, because we must not be trapped with a carbon-intensive industrial structure in the coming low-carbon century. In fact, it is the economies that make these adjustments, and make these adjustments earlier, that will be the economies that have the competitive edge in the decades to come. Not doing so would be akin to us having an economy based on the horse and buggy in the era of the motor car. Pricing carbon through market-based schemes reduces pollution at the lowest cost to the economy. And this is recognised across the economics profession and by respected institutions such as the OECD, the IMF and the Productivity Commission. Most recently in a new OECD report released overnight, which nominates pricing carbon as one of the important policy steps needed to build a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. Pricing carbon and economic growth go hand in hand. The low-carbon goods and services sector is already estimated to be worth nearly $5 trillion and employing 28 million people worldwide. In the United Kingdom, which has had a carbon price since 2002, 9 years ago, and it's been part of the European Union emissions trading scheme since 2005, the low-carbon sector now employs an estimated 1 million people. Pricing carbon will also provide the means for Australia to do its fair share in the global effort, of course, to reduce emissions. Thank you. Thanks, Lawrence. We are the world's 15th largest emitter of greenhouse gases and one of the world's highest emitters per capita. In fact, the highest per capita emitter of greenhouse gases amongst the developed economies. And Australia has a responsibility to take serious action to address climate change and reduce our emissions if we expect other nations to do so. Australia has committed unconditionally to reduce its emissions by 5% from 2000 levels by 2020, and that represents about a 23% cut against business as usual projections. We've committed to a range of increased emissions reductions targets by 2020 if there is strong action by other major emitters. And of course, we're establishing the Climate Change Authority to provide advice to the government in relation to the emissions reduction task ahead. The Clean Energy Act also establishes a long-term target to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Meeting the targets, even our unconditional and bipartisan 5% target, in fact will be hard work. Australia has an emissions-intensive economy. Our electricity supply is principally generated by the combustion, of course, of coal. Due to the growth of our population and our economy, as I indicated a moment ago, the 5% target itself, in fact, represents a 23% decrease from the emissions we would otherwise have produced by 2020. It requires us to put 160 million tonnes less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in 2020, in that year, roughly equivalent to the emissions of 45 million cars, or 80% of emissions from Australia's electricity generation sector in the year 2009. Australia's legislated plan is recognised as a credible and serious response by a major economy and a major emitter. As UK Prime Minister David Cameron wrote to the Prime Minister in August, the Clean Energy Act, and I quote, Prime Minister Cameron, sends a strong and clear signal that Australia is determined to make its contribution to addressing this challenge. It will add momentum to those in both the developed and developing world who are serious about dealing with this urgent threat. In a recent letter to the Prime Minister, United States Congressman Henry Waxman and Edward Markey also hailed the Clean Energy Act as a clear message to the world that we must address the profound challenges posed by climate change. And of course, many of you will recall that several years ago, Congressman Waxman and Markey, of course, sponsored the cap and trade emissions trading scheme debated in the US Congress. The fact is that Australia's legislation does add impetus to global efforts and puts us in a better position to promote strong action by other countries. And many countries have taken a very close interest in what has transpired in Australia over the last 12 months, and particularly with the passage of the legislation 2 weeks ago. Now, the Clean Energy Act will be able to cut Australia's emissions without compromising our economic growth because it harnesses carbon markets at home and internationally. Here in Australia, carbon pollution will no longer be freely put into the atmosphere. From the 1st of July 2012, the carbon price will send a clear signal across the whole economy, creating incentives for large emitters to reduce their pollution. From the 1st of July 2015, Australia will link its emissions trading scheme to international carbon markets. Australian companies will be allowed to use recognised international carbon units to meet their obligations, and this will unlock further efficiencies. Pollution will be reduced at the lowest cost wherever it can be achieved around the globe. Using international permits, will nearly halve the cost of meeting Australia's emissions reduction commitments in 2020. The converse, to turn our back on the power of markets and refusing the qualification of international carbon units, would result in a carbon price, according to the Australian Treasury, of at least $62 per tonne, rather than that which has been forecast with international linking. Markets are the way to cut our emissions at least cost, and that is why Australia will access them domestically and internationally. The broader, deeper and more liquid carbon markets are, the more effectively they work for the benefit of all countries. Even in the face of current global economic uncertainty, billions of dollars have been mobilised to tackle climate change. The global carbon market today is worth around US $140 billion per year. Excuse me. Now that Australia's carbon price is law, a key national interest, of course, is the continued development of the international carbon market for the reasons that I've described. One source of credits that companies in Australia will access is the United Nations Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. This mechanism encourages developing countries to put forward projects that will cut emissions and advance their development. Excuse me. It provides cost-effective abatement for businesses in developed countries like Australia, which buys the units. And it delivers clean technology and investment to developing countries, giving them an economic stake in climate change action. In just 6 years, this mechanism has registered over 3,500 projects across more than 80 countries, locking in nearly 800 million tonnes of abatement. And those figures are a clear rebuff to those who claim there is no international carbon market. And of course, the government is conscious of many of the issues that have been raised about the CDM. And again, the Climate Change Authority that we are establishing will be providing advice to the Australian government about the international carbon units that should be able to be qualified under the emissions trading scheme that we'll be establishing under the Clean Energy Act. But building on the CDM, Australia is also developing new market mechanisms, or helping develop new market mechanisms. One of these, known as the RED Plus mechanism, would generate carbon credits by reducing the deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries that is currently responsible for no less than 18% of global emissions. Now, this is potentially a win for forest communities, a win for businesses seeking low-cost abatement, and a win for the climate. Australia also plans to broaden our access to international credits by linking our carbon market to other emissions trading schemes. The biggest international market now, as you would be well familiar, is that of the European Union. We have already begun discussions with our European counterparts at both the ministerial and technical level on linking our schemes, and the discussions have been very positive to date. This issue, in fact, has been discussed directly at the highest levels between the Prime Minister and the President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso. We are doing the same, indeed, with New Zealand, which has had an emissions trading scheme for several years. China will one day assume the mantle of the world's largest carbon market. And just yesterday, it's very important to note that China, which is our largest trading partner, confirmed that from 2013 it will pilot 7 emissions trading schemes in a number of major municipalities and provinces, covering some more than 200 million people. It could move to an emissions trading scheme from as early on a national level as 2015. And earlier this year I agreed with my Chinese counterpart that Australia and China would share experiences with market mechanisms. Officials have already moved ahead with positive discussions on cooperation. Now, given the global nature of climate change, moving forward collectively with other nations is very important. Just as we've made real progress in Australia too, the world has made real progress over the past year. Consider this. Australia's efforts put us among 90 countries that over the past 12 months have pledged under the UN framework to limit their emissions. Those 90 countries account for 90% of global GDP and over 80% of global emissions. Among those 90 nations are the United States and China, who together account for 37% of global emissions. The US has pledged to reduce emissions by 17% on 2005 levels by the year 2020. China has pledged a 40 to 45% reduction in carbon intensity on 2005 levels by 2020, equating to a 10 to 16% reduction from business as usual emissions. To deliver on their pledges, major emitters are taking action domestically, reflecting the same economic, social and environmental imperatives that drive Australia's actions. 32 countries, as you would be aware, have already got emissions trading schemes in place, including the EU and New Zealand. I've already explained how China could move to a national emissions trading scheme from 2015, but it has also just announced a nationwide sales tax on oil and natural gas. In the US, despite a major economic downturn and a very heated public debate in recent years, there is both national and state-based action. During his visit to Australia last week, President Obama confirmed the US commitment to its target and outlined some of the substantial actions the US is taking to achieve it. Importantly, President Obama also said that the US would be looking for further ways to reduce emissions in coming years. The US is progressively introducing regulations covering over 70% of emissions from stationary sources such as power plants and refineries through permits and standards on industry. These regulations cover greenhouse gas emissions which are at least 7 times larger than those covered under Australia's carbon pricing scheme. President Obama has also announced a new clean energy standard, which will double the share of clean energy sources in the electricity supply mix to 80% by 2035. At the state level, California, the 8th largest economy in the world in its own right, larger than our own, will start an emissions trading scheme next year. The scheme is comparable in coverage to Australia's carbon pricing scheme, and prices are forecast to average US $36 per tonne between 2013 and 2020. South Africa also recently committed to setting a national carbon budget within 2 years and released a discussion paper on a broad carbon tax. Closer to home, Indonesia has a national action plan to reduce emissions by 26% against business as usual by 2020, or 41% with international support. I could keep going on, it might get a bit tedious, but the point that I'm endeavouring to elucidate for you, it is that it is ridiculous to assert, as some continue to do in our political debate, that Australia is somehow acting alone, a maverick in the world, going on its own. Countries are seriously pursuing action on climate change. There are complex debates in many nations and many democracies around the world, but there is a widespread international commitment to tackling this issue. We are seeing real domestic action in countries around the world, along with extensive bilateral and regional cooperation and the growth of carbon markets. In fact, while many look only to international negotiation of a globally binding agreement to assess progress in response to climate change, it is the fact that increasingly it's important to recognise that parallel action is taking place from the ground up in pursuit of the pledges that nations have made. Together with work in the UN negotiations, these developments are building the elements of an effective global response to climate change. But of course, there's still a long way to go. As you know, the 17th Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change will start next week in Durban in South Africa. At last year's conference in Cancun, countries agreed the goal of holding global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the guardrail beyond which climate change risks becoming far more dangerous. The pledges made by 90 countries are not yet enough to reach our 2-degree or lower goal, but they are a good foundation. Australia wants to build on this foundation a new, truly comprehensive climate change regime, one based on the principle of wide global coverage and environmental effectiveness. In Durban, one of the questions we will face is whether developed countries should take on a second legally binding commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol, as the first period will conclude at the end of 2012. And this is a very important issue, and I'd like to address it briefly. It's important to state at the outset that the Kyoto Protocol has been a very important step in addressing climate change, critically important. Many of its elements will be part of a future regime, including access to international carbon markets, which it established. But the Kyoto Protocol alone cannot deliver what the world needs to tackle this complex challenge. The world order now is very different to what it was in the 1990s, when the Kyoto Protocol was first drafted, when parties agreed that only developed countries should commit to legally binding emissions reductions. The Kyoto Protocol was a milestone in dealing with global emissions, and it is the government's intention to continue to implement the commitments, of course, that have been made. But the global community now needs to move to ensure an effective response to the environmental challenge, and that all nations do their fair share to cut global emissions. And the key reason to move on and to consider this more widely is that the Kyoto Protocol's coverage is in fact now too small. It covers at present just 27% of global emissions. A second commitment period, in fact, will potentially see this drop to below 17% in 2013, as Japan, Canada and Russia have signalled that they will not be part of a second commitment period. Like Australia and many others, these countries have also expressed the view that a wider agreement is needed. The coverage of the Kyoto Protocol could in fact drop further to around 13% of emissions by 2020, as developing countries continue to grow and the share of emissions from current developed countries declines as a percentage of the global total. The Kyoto Protocol does not cover the emissions of China or the United States. No system that leaves out the world's two largest emitters, themselves responsible for 37% of global emissions, can be effective or ultimately sustainable. This is not to suggest that other countries are not taking action, and I've already outlined the breadth of a lot of the action that is taking place. But the Australian government's position is that all major emitters, whether developed countries or developing countries, need to back their actions with binding international commitments at the end of the day. We are not, as a government, confined in how this may be achieved. In fact, the government would be prepared to accept a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol if it were matched by parallel commitments by other major emitters. This has been Australia's position, in fact, for more than 3 years, and it will continue to be our position in Durban, where this will be an issue of fairly hot debate. Australia will go to Durban on track to meet our Kyoto Protocol target for the first commitment period, and with legislation that will ensure we meet our international commitments through to 2020 and ultimately to 2050. That is, we do as we say and we deliver. We stand by our commitments and we will deliver them. But in this critical decade, we seek a genuinely global agreement that applies rules to the broadest range of countries, including all major emitters, to help ensure the world can stay within the 2-degree guardrail. All major multilateral agreements take a considerable period of time, and so will this one if we are to get it right. It's taken Australia many years, as I indicated before, to legislate a climate change plan. So it is unsurprising that a comprehensive global climate change agreement is also taking some time. It is a complex issue. Durban will be one stepping stone further along the path, a place where we can make further useful progress towards that goal. It's Australia's position that a comprehensive agreement be in place by 2015. Now, we will continue to work very hard towards achieving this, bearing in mind, of course, the challenges of achieving that outcome. Any new regime should take account of the best science, with the 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report due in 2014 and a review of progress towards the 2 degree or lower goal within the UN negotiations due to complete its work in 2015. We need to ensure that any new regime is durable, even though its realisation will take time. In the meantime, we should put in place more of the building blocks for a new comprehensive climate change regime. Now, these building blocks will complement the substantial action that is occurring around the globe. We should seek agreement on transparency rules so we know countries are in fact implementing their pledges and so the efforts of different countries can be compared. We should also enhance international carbon markets because, as I indicated earlier, these allow the world to reduce pollution at least cost. Establishing the market mechanism to reduce emissions from the world's forests is also another important building block. So are the mechanisms that will help developing countries adapt to climate change, tap into the technology that they need to grow cleanly, and access the funding they need, for example through the Green Climate Fund, a fund which Australia firmly supports and supports standing up in Durban. From Australia's point of view, now that we have legislated for a carbon price, one of our most important goals on the international climate change stage is to ensure our businesses have access to international carbon markets. Those markets, as I said before, are growing irrespective of the developments in the UN negotiations. Emissions trading schemes are being developed around the world, independent of multilateral requirements. In fact, at the UN meetings, it's often outside of the formal negotiations that a lot of the real action takes place. And therefore, in Durban, I'll be taking the opportunity to discuss with many of my counterparts and with business leaders the next steps in building the global carbon market, including through the linking of emissions trading schemes. So in conclusion, I think it's fair to say that the last 12 months has seen a major advance in the global effort to address climate change, and it's certainly seen a major advance in our own country. The Clean Energy Act will enable Australia to do its fair share, and it does so with a very clear-eyed view of Australia's national interests, including a strong economy that continues to enhance our prosperity. As Australia engages internationally at Durban and beyond, a key priority is to continue to develop the carbon markets that will enable countries everywhere to meet their pollution reduction targets at least cost. And we will continue the work towards agreement for a genuinely comprehensive international climate change framework. And finally, could I say a thank you to many of you and to many others throughout the Australian community, whether individuals or organisations, in relation to the public debate that has occurred over the last 12 months in the lead up to the passage of the clean energy legislation. This has certainly been a difficult public policy debate. It's been a pretty vibrant one, and it's certainly one that has been heard in a very widespread way throughout the Australian community. Clearly, the government will continue to be explaining to the community the motivation behind the legislation and the fact that it is economically responsible to be reducing our pollution in this way, that it will be environmentally effective to implement the legislation, and that it is socially fair and equitable. And for all of those of you who've contributed constructively in that debate, in whatever manner and from whatever standpoint, I'd like to thank you, because it is a very important public policy debate. Some of the commentary, of course, has been misleading, and the government will continue to counteract that where it is necessary. But nonetheless, it is very important in a democracy, and we are a vibrant democracy, that we're able to engage in this debate on such an important matter for our country, on such an important matter in the international community, but most importantly, from the government's point of view, on such an important matter for future generations of Australians. This country has a lot to lose if we cannot grapple with this complex challenge of climate change. And I'm proud of the fact that Australia has been engaged in this debate, that we've been able, in our Parliament, to enact this legislation because I know that in the future this will be to the benefit of our economy, to the benefit of our environment, and importantly to the benefit of our society. So thank you for your attention this morning.
Good. Friends, colleagues, as promised, plenty of time for questions. Thank you, Minister, for your address, and thank you for being willing to stay to answer questions. Only two little conditions. Please wait for the microphone before you ask your question. Everything here is recorded. And please identify yourself. And indeed, if you can keep your questions a bit short, it would be nice. See if we can fit in as many people as possible. Protocol is going to require us, and happily so, to let the press have a few of the first questions. So let me do that, and then ask for questions generally. Please.
Minister, I'm Deborah Nesbitt from Thomson Reuters. Minister, I'm interested in your interpretation of a statement from the Chinese government this week that seems to suggest that, it says that if developing countries, i.e. the US, is prepared to sign its Copenhagen Pledge into law, then it may also, developing countries, including China, may also do the same thing. Now, that would seem to suggest that the Chinese government's saying they're ready to sign if the US will sign a new global treaty that includes national targets. Is that your interpretation? And what sort of impact do you think that will have, that statement, on the talks?
Well, there's certainly a lot of commentary coming from many different sources in the lead up to Durban. And I think in a general sense, before I go to the specific, it is very important commentary. What I sense is that many countries are looking for the way forward here at Durban. Of course, the European Union has been contemplating how it may approach the issue of a second commitment period in the Kyoto Protocol and what conditionality it may attach to its approach to the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, the US and China have always been suggesting that they'd like to see each other in some kind of arrangements. And of course, there's plenty of debate amongst many of the other economies approaching Durban. I'm in fact looking forward to getting to Durban where I can speak directly with my counterparts about these issues. I'm hopeful that we will make progress. The Kyoto Protocol, as you would be aware, concludes at the end of next year, at the end of 2012, and it is a valid question, of course, to be asking what takes place, what role might a second commitment period have, but what other matching commitments should be discussed, what negotiations should ensue for a wider agreement. So I take confidence from observations that have been coming out of China in recent weeks, including this week. But I'll hold fire until we get to Durban and we see exactly what that might translate into. One of the other comments, though, overnight or yesterday out of China in relation to the pilot emissions trading schemes is also pertinent. It was a very strong statement of recognition that market mechanisms reduce greenhouse gas emissions at least cost. And I think given the breadth and range of measures that China has been pursuing in an effort to reduce emissions intensity in recent times, it's an observation that recognises that regulatory approaches are sometimes at greater cost than market mechanisms can deliver. And I'm also looking forward to discussion in Durban with my Chinese counterpart about these issues, because the observation that was made, I think, by China over the last 48 hours in that respect is particularly significant.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Minister. My name is Fitrian from Crawford School. I just want to ask, when do you think the new market mechanism will be ready to enter the international global carbon market, including Australian market? In particular, I'm interested in having your thought about RED Plus and the challenge of developing countries to prepare or to make RED Plus ready, as well as the challenge that they try to implement pilots on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, of course, there is already a significant market mechanism that I referred to in my speech, the Clean Development Mechanism, which is providing carbon units in the international marketplace. And, excuse me, I think that will continue and remain to be a very important marketplace for carbon units internationally. The other areas of market development, of course, include the growth of emissions trading schemes in various jurisdictions that I pointed to. But in relation to RED Plus, the government is very keen to contribute in any way that we can to the negotiations to bring RED Plus forward under the UN framework, but also to engage in negotiations with other countries with an interest in it, including Indonesia, to see ways in which we can support the development of particular projects internationally. So I'm certainly hopeful that in coming years and in advance of 2020 that we can see RED Plus emerge as a major way of tackling emissions reductions from deforestation and the degradation of forests. I think it'll be a key mechanism, but clearly there's some work to continue to be done.
Frank Yotzo, Crawford School, ANU. Minister, as you pointed out, we would expect that Australia will invest potentially in a major way in emission reductions overseas, probably in developing countries. Now, it would seem that this is a great opportunity to actually leverage structural change in these countries, and many have argued that the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, is perhaps not the optimal way to leverage additional fundamental action. To what extent do you think it will be possible to design new mechanisms in addition to the sphere of RED and deforestation that will give more comprehensive engagement by developing countries in response to carbon payments that may come out of an Australian carbon pricing scheme?
Thank you, Frank. Well, we will always remain committed to try to work under the UN framework to try and improve the rules and the market mechanisms that it has so far fostered. So we'll certainly have a concentration on that. But one other bilateral discussion that I'm keenly anticipating in Durban is with my Japanese counterpart, and you'd be well aware that the Japanese are looking at the development of bilateral offset mechanisms in the Asia-Pacific region. And that is another alternative development of a carbon market within the region that Japan is looking to sponsor, and there was some reference to it in the outcome of the East Asia Summit just recently. So that's one other area where I think we will certainly have an interest in finding out what Japan is hoping for and anticipating, and seeing if it may be something with which we can work. But we will look at all of the options very carefully. It is important work that the Climate Change Authority will be asked to undertake, of course, because we'll be relying upon the expert advice of the Climate Change Authority on the carbon units from markets internationally that should be able to be used by Australian business to surrender for their obligations under our own scheme. So I think there's a good deal of work to go, but I'm very encouraged by the focus that there is on carbon markets internationally. And when you think of some of the things that I described in the speech and that you've also raised, of course, Frank, the Asia-Pacific region has a great potential to develop as a significant carbon market. There's a very strong European focus, of course, in markets at the moment for quite understandable reasons. The EU scheme is a very large one, but with California coming on, the potentiality for RED Plus in years to come, the schemes in China that are developing, the commitment of the Korean government to introduce emissions trading in 2015, the initiatives of Japan in developing bilateral offsets markets, what's going on in some of the provinces in Canada. New Zealand's already got a scheme, we'll have a scheme. I think there's a significant carbon market that can evolve all around the Pacific Rim and throughout Asia. So I think the prospects are very positive, and we'll be keen to work on a bilateral and multilateral basis to develop them.
Good, thank you.
Andrew Bilski from the Adaptation Strategies branch. As you know, the key with a lot of trading scheme is on their operationalisation, and many developing countries have designed their trading schemes on an indirect basis, using energy, as well as on a relative basis, as in terms of per unit, as opposed to an absolute basis. Can you tell us a bit more about the design of the 7 trading schemes being trialled at the provincial level in China, and as to whether they're on a relative or absolute basis, and specifically whether they address emissions directly?
Well, I'm afraid I can't do that at this point in time. It's something that I'm looking forward to discussing when I get to Durban. We have had some officials in China in recent weeks to open up discussions with China. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government about climate change matters, so there are regular consultations, but we have discussed in a reasonably informal way to date with China the way in which we may be able to provide some experience that we've gained through the design of our own scheme that they may or may not wish to take into account in the design of one of the particular schemes within China. But we'll get a better idea of that and what is planned when we're in Durban, and I hope and anticipate that we'll have an ongoing engagement with China about the construction of those schemes during the course of the next 12 months. I think probably from my observation they're looking to trial a range of approaches to emissions trading so as to see what might suit them most effectively.
Elizabeth Proctor, ANU undergrad. If, say, China and India took on binding emissions targets, would that mean they would stop accepting CDM projects, and would the CDM then be significantly reduced?
Well, that's for them to work out exactly how they'd want to relate any emissions trading arrangements they put into place with the CDM, but there's no reason that I can see that they wouldn't want to maintain the CDM. We're certainly anticipating the CDM will continue in place in future years, and the CDM governing board has currently initiated a review of the CDM and how it will operate in future years. So I think it'll continue to operate, and we'll find ways in which it might operate in parallel with trading schemes.
Minister, this side of the room.
Julie McDonald from IT Power. Australia has an existing mandatory renewable energy target which requires certain entities to meet obligations that are designed to increase renewable energy in Australia. How is that scheme going to interact with an international trading scheme, and how are we going to ensure that an international trading scheme doesn't detract from investment in renewable energy in Australia?
Well, thank you. Well, the renewable energy target in Australia is a domestic policy setting that's designed to drive, as you indicated, the generation of 20% of our electricity supply from renewable energy sources by the year 2020. Now, that's only 8 years or so away. We're expecting it to drive about $20 billion worth of investment in renewable energy in order to be able to achieve that target, which is a very significant level of investment. But it's a scheme that will operate within the domestic economy, and the linkage internationally that we have will be from the 1st of July through the carbon price mechanism itself. It's worthwhile mentioning, I think, in relation to this issue, a couple of the other elements of the clean energy legislation that has now passed, or there's some aspects of it still to pass, but the carbon price itself, of course, by sending a market signal, is also going to make it far more feasible for investors to invest in renewable energy projects, and it, in partnership with the RET, I think will be a very significant boost for renewable energy investment in Australia. But we are establishing, as you're possibly aware, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, which will be an agency invested with $3.6 billion to provide grants to support the development of renewable energy technologies. We'll also be establishing the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, in which the government will make an equity investment of $10 billion in coming years. It will be charged to operate on a more commercial basis, of course. We've announced the inaugural chair, Gillian Broadbent, who is a member of the Reserve Bank Board. She's currently consulting in the community. in relation to the development of an investment mandate that the government would then incorporate into the legislation setting the corporation up. It should be able to leverage significant investments to help commercialise renewable technologies and clean energy technologies. So I think just in general answer to the question, we are going to see a very significant boost for renewable energy in our country through a combination of all of the policy initiatives that have been put into place. And so we should, because we've got rich renewable energy resources. We've put in place market arrangements that will support the investment to take place, and there's a noticeable shift, I think, since the passage of the legislation, or certainly since its passage through the House of Representatives within the renewables sector. That is a notable shift in confidence that the policy settings are finally in place to unleash the potential that we've got in all of that area.
Yes, here.
Adityani Putri, the Crawford School. Just following up on the RED Plus question, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about Australia's position on RED Plus and the negotiation points that Australia plans to push or support in the upcoming Durban talks. Thank you.
Well, it's essentially, thank you for the question, it's essentially to continue to contribute to trying to make sure that we get the rules in place, the transparency that's necessary, that will provide confidence for RED Plus schemes to operate as effective markets and generators of carbon units. We need to, get, I hope, a significant level of progress at a multilateral level about all of those rules and the importance of a market mechanism to drive this, so that all players can have confidence that we can go about supporting individual projects. So really making sure that we get general progress on the construction of the rules and the transparency that will be necessary to provide confidence that there are, a genuine reduction of emissions that are contributing to the creation of the relevant certificates or carbon units.
All right, in the back.
Barry Norton from the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies here at the ANU. Hi. Yeah. I want to refer to two basic propositions.
It's a directional mic. You'll have to hold it.
How's that?
Yep.
Yeah. Two basic propositions and then a factual question. You've rightly referred to the internationally tradable emissions as a mechanism by which given targets can be reached at minimum cost. The second proposition is that, as praiseworthy as the 5% reduction is, it's a long way from the 80% reduction by 2050, and the same question arises at an international level. I wonder if you'd comment generally about the dynamic between a least cost approach, both nationally and internationally, and the need to radically tighten targets over that period. That dynamic, and secondly, a factual question. In the earlier climate change legislation under the Rudd government, as recommended by Ross Garner, I believe that there was a conditional target as well as the 5% one, yes, which was at a 20% level. Well, I think that's the question.
I understand what you're asking, yeah. And we still do have the same targets that the government articulated over the last few years. So the 5% reduction over year 2000 levels is an unconditional target. It's a target supported by the coalition as well, so it's a bipartisan target from a political point of view. And as I said when I was speaking, that's a 23% reduction against business as usual projections for our emissions growth to 2020. Not inconsiderable. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the targets can be increased to the year 2020 to 15% and up to 25% reductions over year 2000 levels should the conditions be satisfied. And of course those conditions essentially relate to the extent of international action that is being taken. That is an issue that in the legislation will now be placed before the Climate Change Authority. That is, it'll be chaired by Bernie Fraser, a former Treasury Secretary and Reserve Bank Governor, In due course, we'll be appointing the other members of the authority, but the legislation, of course, provides for the particular areas of expertise that they would be expected to have, both in science and economics, etc. But the authority will be charged with the duty of providing advice to the government, having taken into account the science, the extent of international action, the nature of international agreement about emissions reductions, and a whole host of other elements, the position in our economy, etc. Having taken all of that into account, we'll be recommending to government by early 2014 the emissions reduction caps and consequently the relationship with the target to the year 2020 that we will apply from the commencement of emissions trading on the 1st of July 2015. That's a long-winded way of saying it's going to be recommending to government how steeply we should be reducing our emissions through to the year 2020. The context for this, which is sometimes lost in some of the community debate, which rightly focuses on what the science is telling us needs to be done, but the context for this from a domestic economic point of view, we need to understand clearly, and that is that we are a very emissions-intensive economy. We do rely for almost 90% of our electricity generation on the combustion of coal. And that is quite different to many other economies internationally. What it means is that the economic adjustment in our own economy is not insignificant when we are thinking about our emissions reduction objectives. And we've got to go about it in a sensible way. So by establishing the mechanisms to provide emissions reduction levels through to 2020, and then the longer-term target to 2050, an 80% reduction over 2000 levels by 2050, the Climate Change Authority will be able to have a look at all the factors I described and also think, well, how do we sort of start to budget our way through to the emissions reductions by 2050? What's the pace of investment and change that's taking place to achieve the emissions reductions? How efficiently is the carbon price mechanism driving the emissions reductions? And of course, we need to make significant reductions in emissions in our electricity generating sector if we are going to get there. And so we'll be looking for a number of indicia. One of them, of course, is the pace of investment in renewable energy and the development of technology, and having a look at the progress in the RET, and the Climate Change Authority will be looking carefully at those matters as well. But another one is sort of more immediate impact of the scheme on investment in current electricity generating capacity. And one very encouraging thing, and I know there's debate, of course, about these matters, but one very encouraging thing has been the announcement by True Energy that it would invest $3.6 billion in 2 new electricity generating plants in Queensland. They will be gas-fired. Yes, it's a fossil fuel, but gas will be a very important transitional fuel for us in energy generation in the years to come, because acknowledging there's a debate about the entire production cycle, but the fact of the matter is that in the combustion of gas, it's going to be able to generate electricity, units of electricity at a significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when compared to coal. So we'll be looking at all of these matters and the pace of change that's driven in our own electricity generation and in our economy. In many of the discussions that I have with counterparts internationally that have got carbon pricing mechanisms in their economy, all of them, I think without exception, have indicated to me that once they got a price into place, they were surprised at the way in which and how efficiently emissions reductions can be achieved once there's a price in the marketplace. And all of my discussions with the business community now, they're no longer about, some of them were a bit fractious at first over the last 12 months, but we've moved on from that, and the discussions are now about how we're going to achieve it. And I can say to you that I already know that a carbon price in a very practical way is a sensible, significant and efficient incentive for the largest emitters in the economy to reduce their emissions, and that's what they're thinking about.
Thank you.
Pierre Scorich from the department. Minister, as you've said, that this is a critical decade, and it's really a global critical decade. Given that a decade is actually quite a short period globally, while the price on carbon certainly creates a market incentive, on the flip side of that, I guess there's also supporting innovation. How do you see internationally the collaboration working on innovation to ensure that new technologies can hit the marketplace globally at a quicker pace, given the very short time frames that we're dealing with internationally?
Well, this is a slightly vexed issue in the international negotiations at time. Of course, it is critical to see the dispersion of low emissions and renewable technologies internationally if we're going to tackle this issue. Of course, patents are held on many technologies, as you would be well aware. There's a debate that goes on in the UN framework that we should somehow overcome all of that. I think there are legal and commercial realities about the dispersion of technologies that are just obviously have to be taken into account. But nonetheless, I think we can find ways in which to support the dispersion of the technologies that are necessary through bilateral relationships, through support for adaptation, through support for mitigation efforts in developing economies, through the Green Climate Fund, for example. I think there'll be a host of ways that we can try and support what is obviously a very important environmental objective within the realities of, the legal and economic constructs that exist internationally.
Up in the back.
Andrew Schuler, a member of the public. I wonder if you can tell us what the government's reaction to the rather pessimistic report from UBS about the workings of the European trading scheme is.
Well, thank you. Just in general in relation to Europe, of course, a lot of the commentary, understandably, is about the depreciation in the unit prices under the European scheme and the uncertainty that's in the marketplace there. So just in observation to that, I think that is an entirely predictable consequence of the debt crisis that is being experienced in Europe, that the European nations are endeavouring to come to grips with. All markets have been affected by the crisis that is being experienced in Europe, and the carbon market is no different. But of course, the UBS analyst this week that was the subject of some of the media reporting indicated a more gloomy outlook for the European scheme itself and its effectiveness. It's important to note, though, the government doesn't agree with that assessment, and nor do a number of the other UBS analysts. And I'm afraid I don't have the reference to the specific analysts, but I was ready for question time on this issue during the week, and there are in fact a number of UBS analysts that have quite a contrary position. It's part of the debate about the efficacy of these schemes, but nonetheless, we've worked enormously hard over a significant period of time. When I say we, I mean Australian governments, including the Howard government, at thinking about the most effective policy response to this issue. And it is important to recall that a lot of the foundational work for the legislation that has now passed through the Parliament was in fact done during the Howard government period. It set up the greenhouse energy reporting system so that we've had emissions reporting for some time. That was a precursor to John Howard developing an emissions trading scheme, quite similar in its construct to that which is now in the Clean Energy Act. And, John Howard took that as a policy to the election in 2007. In fact, there's not been a great deal of policy divergence on this issue until Tony Abbott took the opposition leadership. The point being that we are firm in the view and the commitment, and all the economic advice is to the same effect, that a market mechanism, a price on carbon, a trading scheme, integration in international carbon markets is the most efficient way for us in our economy to reduce our emissions. And we won't be put off by one single UBS analyst adversely reflecting upon the European scheme.
Ambassador.
Hello, Pedro Villagra, Ambassador of Argentina. In the context of low emissions for electricity generation, if and when nuclear energy becomes economically viable in Australia, do you see any possibility of actually allowing it to proceed commercially?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch part of that.
In the context of the low emission generations that you will need technologies,
Yes.
if and when, because that's a big if and when, nuclear energy, baseload nuclear energy,
yes.
could become economically viable for Australia. Do you see any possibility of actually proceeding with it?
I think the debate about nuclear energy, is very often a theoretical debate. I mean, it's an understandable political debate, but really, the judgment will be made, I think, at the end of the day by what the commerciality and economics of investment in nuclear energy is suggesting. The debate will become a real one, in a real economic sense, when the economics demand that it be considered. And at the moment, although I know there's been a few contrary assessments made, but at the moment it is not, the subject of substantial debate, fundamentally because the numbers don't add up. It is an expensive form of power. There are other, of course, very important and wider public policy considerations, and my government, by virtue of the Labor Party's platform, doesn't support nuclear energy for other public policy reasons. But I think it'll come into more focus once the numbers start to add up. In the meantime, we have rich resources in this country for solar energy, for geothermal energy, for wave energy, for wind power, by reducing emissions, for reducing emissions in our coal-fired electricity sector, by improving the efficiency of the turbines that are in use, by using our gas resources to reduce emissions. There's a heap that we can do in our energy sector to bring our emissions down, and we need to get on with that.
Right. Good. Thank you.
Tom Worthington from the ANU College of Engineering and Computer Science. I train engineers and other professionals how to measure
a very fine profession.
Carbon emissions. And we have an international standardised set of skills to do this. It takes about 6 months to train a professional to do it. Has your department given thought to whether we will have enough people to be able to carry out the process and ensure that we're confident that it's done properly in Australia and around the world?
Well, I think, we're a market economy, of course, and so investments that demand particular skills tends, albeit with some lag in the economy, to drive greater educational opportunities for people with the skills that are in demand. But governments need to be there, you're quite right, having a look at what we're going to need. We've made some pretty significant investments to try and improve the skills base of the Australian workforce over the last several years. We'll continue to do so. I haven't, I have to confess, had that as a central focus of my work, and nor has the department over the last 12 months or even the last couple of years, because we've been concentrating very strongly on the mitigation efforts and on the design and development of the carbon price mechanism and the related measures that we're putting into place. I'm now, of course, thankfully yesterday was the last day of Parliament for the year, or the House of Reps at least, after drawing breath and attending the climate change negotiations in Durban, the next thing on my horizon is thinking about our work program for the next 12 months, 24 months in particular. And I know there are a number of obvious things that need to come more strongly in the frame: attention to adaptation requirements, the development of partnerships in international markets that I've spoken enough about, I think, but what other measures domestically are going to make sure that we embrace this successfully, including skills.
Good, thank you.
I'm hoping this is on. Minister, thank you for making the time to come out today. My name's Walter Reinhardt. I'm a member of the Fenner School at ANU. Just a quick question in the lead up to Durban and the post-Kyoto negotiations. A parallel which may or may not have been made is with sort of the world trade negotiations and the Doha round, which has stalled for 10 years and spawned a range of bilateral and regional trade agreements.
Yes.
How do you view bilateral and regional emissions reductions or adaptation agreements as an alternative to a failed world agreement?
Very positively is the short answer to that question. I suppose I'm pretty pragmatic about this. We are very committed to the processes under the UN Framework Climate Change Convention. It is the only game in town, is the truth of it, for a wide multilateral agreement that is ultimately needed. But in the meantime, as I've described, there's a lot happening on the ground up in the implementation of pledges, and a lot that can be done on a bilateral basis and a regional basis, if you like. And I'll be giving that pretty careful thought in coming weeks and months, how we can advance our relationships in the Asia-Pacific region where markets are evolving, and how we can support their development, and how Australian businesses will be able to access them as we move to emissions trading from the 1st of July 2015. And I think at the end of the day, in a practical view, the more that we build from the ground up, the stronger the case and the easier it is at a multilateral level to try and get an accommodation that secures an agreement. So I'm all for acting at every level we can.
Good. I'm happy to give a student a second go. No, Young Hong, here. Good.
Will the Clean Energy Finance Corporation consider funding natural gas, given that they could fund things that have no emissions associated?
Well, it's a matter for the Clean Energy Finance Corp, and I suppose I should make this clear. It's not going to be wandering around handing out dobs of money for particular technologies or to support particular fuel sources or something on some discriminatory basis. It will be expected, and its mandate will reflect this in legislation, to operate on a commercial basis. And you might say, well, OK, if that's the case, why can't the private sector just do it in any event? The reason that Gillian Broadbent is consulting in the finance community and the renewable energy sector and many other parts of the economy, institutional investors and the like, getting a feel for the technologies and fuel sources, is to identify what is needed to try and overcome some gaps that currently exist on all accounts that help get particular technologies commercialised and into the marketplace. You know, many investors in the private sector perhaps are not necessarily that cognizant of particular technologies that might well be able to be commercialised and taken to the market, and so the Finance Corporation will identify why those gaps are there and how it may be able to help broker the involvement of private finance to bring things to the marketplace as well. Now, what those projects and the relationship to any fuel source that might be involved, may involve, will be a matter for the corporation itself. The principal constraint that we have provided is that at least half of the 10 billion must be leveraged, at least half of it, so at least 5 billion must be leveraged to support renewable technologies. There may be other low emissions technologies that would fall into the categories that it may support, but that's a decision for the corporation itself.
Yes, in the back.
Hi, Phil Einfield, private investor. You spoke a moment ago about a lot of investment going into generation facilities and transmission facilities out of the money that's being raised out of the emissions trading and the emissions charges. Many people would say that these industries have had some spectacular increases in prices to members of the community over the last few years. And when I hear about the investments, including building better turbines and making their turbines more efficient and whatever, many of which industries, if they were working well, would have done.
Yes.
Right? They should have done. So I get a bit nervous putting my faith in the continued regulation, and these are highly regulated industries. And to what extent do you think the current outcome is really a manifestation of the failure of our regulatory authorities and the developers of public policy over this period, many of whom have been very well paid to give advice and to regulate prices? And what can you do to assure me that we're not going to put the same people in those jobs again to come up with the same answers?
Well, thank you for that. It's an interesting question, but But in some respects, it's sort of confusing two elements here. That is a regulatory approach and a market approach that would drive some of the changes that I mentioned earlier. Let's just look at the electricity price regulation and why prices are being driven up and why regulatory authorities have been approving those. About 2/3 of the price rises we've seen in the electricity market, just generalising on a national basis, have been as a consequence of investments in the poles and wires and the distribution system that's been long overdue. And yes, it shouldn't have been allowed to lag for so long. And consumers now, of course, are facing steep rises in electricity prices as a consequence of those investments not being made in a more staged and planned way in the past. And it is worthy of examination as to why that has occurred and the efficacy and efficiency of the price rises that people are experiencing. And of course, Professor Garneau, in some of the work that he contributed to the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee, reflected upon some of that and the guaranteed rates of returns that are involved to state instrumentalities, for example. So, yes, there are some issues there. That's all on the agenda of my colleague, the Minister for Resources and Energy, now to discuss with the state energy ministers how we can examine all of that and achieve efficient outcomes in the electricity market in particular. To some extent, of course, the renewable schemes that have been operating at a state and federal level have fed in to electricity prices as well, and there's been a good degree of community debate about that. Are they the most economically efficient, is the question. Are they equitable, is a fair question. You know, if there are only tens of thousands of homes that benefit from effectively a subsidy that operates through higher electricity prices, and many low-income houses and people who live in flats and pensioners and others who can never afford or physically can't put a solar panel on their roof, is it fair that they pay? So those issues are being debated a little more widely, which is all leading us towards the question, what is the most efficient way economically of driving change in the energy sector? And we examined all of these matters in tremendous detail in recent years. Professor Garneau turned his mind to it, of course, but there's report after report after report. We commissioned the Productivity Commission as part of the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee's work to have a look at these schemes in Australia and in other jurisdictions. And of course, the Productivity Commission found that if the purpose of solar panels on rooftops was to achieve emissions reductions, so if that's the purpose of it, and of course there are other public policy goals that may be involved, the abatement cost, the carbon price that's represented for those emissions reductions is about $450 a tonne. And we're talking about a starting price of $23 a tonne for a widely based carbon price in the economy. And as public policy makers, you must consider these issues. Because for fairness, for equity, for economic efficiency, for ensuring that we maintain our competitive position in international marketplaces, we must make reforms like this at lowest cost to the economy and achieve and harvest the most significant emissions reductions as a consequence. And when I'm talking about improving the efficiency of turbines, and you make the observation, well, perhaps people should have been thinking about that before. The reason that it has not happened is there's been no price signal to drive it effectively. Prices can be passed on through the electricity system for particular infrastructure investments, but for the first time now, a coal-fired electricity generator will be needing to buy a permit for every tonne of their emissions. And that has immediately got them thinking. And so they are thinking, well, if I can achieve just a 4% improvement in efficiency in the operation of my turbine, that's 4% less permits, and for a coal-fired generator, that's a significant amount of money. If I can, use other mechanisms to store carbon, or if I can invest in partnering a renewable technology with my coal-fired technology and I can reduce emissions by 20 or 25%, it's a huge dividend. And without the market signal and the price incentive, those decisions are not seriously considered. That's the truth of the matter.
Good question. Nice answer.
And I'd better take the last one.
The last one, very short, please.
Thank you. John Virgo from the British High Commission. Minister, I wondered if I could just take you finally back to Durban again and ask you to say a few more words about climate finance to support mitigation and adaptation in developing countries. You mentioned the Green Climate Fund. I'm wondering, what's your assessment on the prospects for agreement on that at Durban, and what contribution Australia might make to such a fund?
Well, thank you. Firstly, of course, we've been contributing along with the UK and many other nations in the form of Fast Start finance. We allocated $600 million for that, and that's fundamentally been committed. Last year at Cancun, though, of course, we got discussions underway in a serious manner about a green climate fund that could accommodate the pledges that were also made at Copenhagen to mobilise $100 billion US per year by 2020 into a climate fund that can help with mitigation and adaptation efforts. I co-chaired those negotiations at Cancun, and they were pretty painstaking. I wasn't very experienced in the multilateral fora, so I had a bit of a learning experience, and as a former union negotiator, I had to learn a little more patience. But we made good progress, and we set up a transitional committee that has been meeting throughout this year, and Australia's been a co-chair of that as well. And it has done a lot of strong work to develop the governance arrangements for standing up the Green Climate Fund. And as I said in my speech, we'll be supporting, of course, the fund and supporting the effort to stand it up, that is, formally get it going at Durban. That leaves the issue then of contributions to the fund, and that's a matter that I think many of us in a bilateral way and then in the multilateral discussions will be considering what occurs. But it'll be part, ultimately, whether it's at Durban or at a subsequent conference, part of a balanced approach to achieving progress in the international negotiations. And it's not surprising, of course, that many countries would take the view that if they are contributing to the Green Climate Fund to support mitigation and adaptation efforts, and there's discussion of technology transfer that I was asked about earlier, that we also want to see progress in other areas, improvement in the verification and measurement and implementation of emissions reduction pledges and the transparency that is available to ensure and compare what's going on between different countries. And all of the other building blocks, are interrelated. And so we'll certainly continue to be supportive of the establishment of the fund. We'll make judgments about our contribution to it in time. It's not just a matter of public contributions or government contributions from our point of view. There's been a good degree of discussion about innovative sources of finance that would discharge the obligation to mobilise $100 billion a year by 2020, and there's been a considerable amount of work done on that issue as well that'll be discussed at Durban. One of my former colleagues, Bob McMullen's been very active on the government's behalf in discussions in that respect. So we'll be looking also to what the sources of finance may be and how finance can be mobilised, not just through government contribution. So finally, with that, Tom, can I just
provide a thank you, Minister?
You certainly may, but before you do, I'd just like to thank everyone. You've been very attentive and listening to me, and I appreciate it very much. Thank you for coming.
Minister, I want to add my own personal thank you. It's your second trip to the Crawford School, and we're happy to have you back again soon, and please make it soon. The Crawford School's stated purpose is leading public policy for a better world, and that's something that you do so well every day. On behalf of all of us, I want to thank you for your efforts, and I want to wish you good luck in Durban.